good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm excited to welcome you to today's webinar on search hiring and hiring mission critical talent into federal agencies by anitaB.org, the Partnership for Public Service, and the Tech Talent Project. My name is Peter Kamachai, and I'm a manager with the Partnership for Public Service. Before we get started, I'd like to take a minute to review some information about Zoom webinars. The toolbar buttons that you will need today are the ones to access the chat and the one to access the Q&A. To use the chat, which is the button with the one speech bubble, use that to introduce yourself, let us know where you're joining from, what agency you're with. Please also use the chat to let us know if you're having any technical difficulties, and you can do so by sending a message to all panelists, and we'll try to get that squared away. And to use the Q&A, that's the button with the two speech bubbles. You can use that to submit questions to our panelists. The questions will either be answered by one of our staff members or answered live by our panelists during the Q&A. I'm also going to note that we are recording this event, and we'll post it on our organization's websites in the coming weeks. With that, I'm going to turn to Michelle Amante, the Partnership's Vice President for Federal Workforce Programs. Michelle, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks, Peter, and welcome everyone again. We are so excited to co-host this event. We're going to kick off today's session going over a report that the partnership released in October of 2020 that was specifically on surge hiring, and I hope that you all find helpful as we kick off today's session. So to do this overview of this report with me, Paul Peach is also here, who is our lead researcher on this report. So Peter, if you go to the next slide. As we were doing our research, really there are four main reasons for why an agency would choose to surge hire. One is the one you probably often think about, and that's an emergency response. So a natural disaster, a financial crisis, a global pandemic. These are things that would cause us to trigger a surge hiring event. Also things like a new federal agency, DHS, CFPB. There have been several examples of these over the last 2 decades that have caused the government to have to hire, in large mass numbers. Attrition is another reason. For example, USDA, there's a lot of press over some of the agencies moving to the Midwest that caused some attrition last year. So examples like that, where an agency will lose a large number of people at one time and then have to rebuild parts of their organization. And then lastly, emergent skills, which is one of the things we're thinking about today, such as cyber or AI. So the government is always trying to stay on top of these things, and in often cases have to compete with the private sector for surge hiring. Next slide, and now I'm going to pass it over to Paul.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome everyone. So as Michelle said, we first, through our research, identified those circumstances for surge hiring. And as we continued, we surfaced a number of tactics for surge hiring and grouped them into the 3 strategies that you see here. Next slide, please. The first strategy is to understand the many available hiring authorities and to identify which ones best fit the hiring need and or the talent pool being considered. And just to note, there are many, many hiring authorities. GAO did a report, I believe in 2014, which identified 105 separate hiring authorities, and that was not an exhaustive list. So there are many of them out there. Now, agencies should consider not only agency-specific authorities, if they're available to them, but also government-wide authorities, comparing their flexibilities and limitations relative to their staffing needs. But because there is no single best authority for all circumstances of surge hiring, it is best to think about hiring authorities as a toolkit. There's no magic bullet authority, only the hiring authorities most useful for each situation. Next slide, please. Here are some of the hiring authorities highlighted in the report. Each one of these authorities has its own benefits, but each has its limitations. So for example, direct hiring authorities, those enable agencies to hire qualified candidates to a competitive service without applying veterans preference or applicant rating and ranking, which can expedite the process. But these authorities are not widely available, and because many staff are unfamiliar with them, the application of them when available actually may slow down the hiring process. So it's not a sure thing. Schedule A, meanwhile, is often seen as a panacea authority, but in reality, most Schedule A authorities have limited applicability Only 3 we identified could be routinely used for search hiring, and even those in only certain circumstances. Now, the reinstatement authority allows non-competitive hiring of former federal employees to the competitive service, so a great source of talent. But the rehired staff are employed at the same GS level they held when they left federal service, no matter what experience they've gained or the skills they've developed in the interim period. As a result, there was really no financial incentive for former staff to rejoin the civil service. And finally, the military spouse non-competitive authority is often seen as a win-win, as it's a non-competitive authority and accelerates hiring, and it also supports military families. But the challenge is recruiting eligible military spouses. It's actually rather difficult and it undermines utility of authority. And I just want to note quickly that the report includes a matrix of hiring authorities, which details these here, as well as the other options that we think are most conducive to search hiring. Next slide, please. By developing recruiting infrastructure, agencies can make the first part of the search hiring process more efficient and effective. It also increases the chances that hiring actions are successful, thereby avoiding the wasted time of restarting the hiring process in the wake of an unfilled hiring certificate. To develop the infrastructure, recruiting infrastructure, agencies specifically, they can hire professional recruiters or train existing HR and programming staff to act as recruiters. They can leverage technology such as project management software. They can leverage workforce and talent pipeline data. They can focus on demonstrating mission match with potential candidates to really demonstrate the reason why candidates should want to work for the agency. And they can proactively recruit former employees or coordinate with professional associations and other groups to identify potential candidates. In addition, recruiters can increase efficiency of hiring by shepherding candidates through the hiring process. From first contact through the final offer, recruiters can help set realistic expectations about the hiring timeline, and they can make sure that candidates know what to expect at each juncture. This helps the candidates be responsive to any administrative requests, paperwork requests, for example. It can also help them remain engaged throughout the process, which ultimately helps prevent the candidates from withdrawing their application out of frustration. And while it's possible to develop recruiting infrastructure during a hiring surge, it's advisable to do that prior to hiring surges. In short, agencies that don't treat recruiting as a special skill set are not well prepared for hiring surges. Next slide. Through a project management approach, agencies can better recognize inefficiencies in their staffing process, such as treating hiring as a series of disconnected steps instead of interrelated continuum, which is what it really is. HR teams should prioritize clear and frequent communication with candidates, as well as with hiring managers, subject matter experts, agency leaders, and other stakeholders. Good communication with candidates is important because it encourages their responsiveness and keeps them engaged, as I mentioned before. While good communication with hiring managers and subject matter experts and agency leaders helps facilitate their individual roles in implementing the hiring surge. It keeps them abreast of what's going on and when they need to contribute, and that helps keep the train moving. Surge hiring, like all process improvement efforts, thrives on access to data and the ability to make it actionable. Examples of data that's useful is workforce data such as vacancy rates and average time to hire. Those can be used as benchmarks to gauge how effective a hiring surge is. And a good example of a data analysis tool is a hiring dashboard that the Airforce uses for all of its civil service hiring. The dashboard visualizes the progress of every hiring action, and it pinpoints in real time who is responsible for what and what steps of the process have been completed and which are outstanding. This makes the process more transparent, and it also encourages a culture of accountability, which fosters collaboration among the various stakeholders of the hiring process and helps them recognize, avoid, and overcome any process bottlenecks. Finally, prioritizing the role of hiring managers is important, as they are often subject matter experts with an informed perspective that can make, for example, position descriptions more accurate and attractive. They can inform the design of strategies for effective recruitment, assessment, and applicant rating. and they can help identify the best hiring authority for every hiring action. A good example of this is found at GSA's Technology Transformation Services, where there's a hiring chart that's designed not to only educate hiring managers about the many hiring options available, but also walk them through a set of decisions to help them identify the best approach for every position vacancy. Next slide, please. And the report concludes with a surge hiring roadmap, which is seen here, that graphically demonstrates where the surge hiring strategies can be applied throughout the federal hiring process. The roadmap is based on the 5 basic steps of hiring. It also shows how the strategies I've been talking about are interrelated. So as you may have noticed, for example, the developing recruitment infrastructure is based in part on applying a project management approach. And likewise, a project management strategy informs strategic application of hiring authorities. So all 3 of these strategies are related to one another and should be thought as such. And with that, I'll turn it back to Michelle to discuss the report's 2 case studies. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Paul. There are great examples throughout the report of agencies that are excelling in different aspects of the strategies that Paul spoke about. But there are 2 very, very strong exemplars from the pandemic that we highlighted, and I just wanted to share quickly with you today. One is Department of Veteran Affairs. As you can imagine, as hospitals were affected across the country, VA was not immune from that. And they needed to hire very, very quickly to help serve our veterans across the nation. And what they were able to accomplish is really incredible. So between March and October, they hired over 55,000 people. And I believe before the end of the year, that reached 75,000. So when you think about government and how difficult it is to hire, it's really astronomical that they were able to accomplish that. And the way that they did it was they hit on all 3 of the strategies that we talked about. So the first one, hiring authorities. So they knew which hiring authorities would be most impactful. They had done the research and they went to OPM and asked for 39 direct hiring authorities to help bring in the critical medical staff that they needed to serve vets. Secondly, on recruitment, they made it easy for physicians to apply for jobs. They did not make them go through the typical USA Jobs process. They had on their website a button that said, talk to a recruiter. Physicians were able to hit that button and a recruiter called them within a day. So they made it easy for the applicant. They also contacted former employees, not only of the VA, but across government. They used their own databases and as well as one from OPM to try to bring people back so that they could help with vets. They also used a project management approach, as Paul talked about, to streamline the process. They worked collectively as a management team. They were initially meeting every single day to look at metrics, to discuss the process, to think about tweaking it, to make sure that this was effective on bringing people on. They also streamlined the onboarding process, bringing it down to from time to hire to when that person was onboarded. Sometimes it was less than 2 weeks. Often there were examples where it was only 3 days, because they were able to change the credentialing process to really make this happen to serve the public. And as you can imagine, it was quite a feat. It took a lot of staff, a lot of hours, a lot of overtime. But once again, what they were able to accomplish was really incredible. And we have more examples of what they did in the report. Secondly, the Small Business Administration, before the pandemic, they were an agency of 4,200 people, so relatively small. And they hired over 6,000 people during the pandemic. So they doubled the size of their agency. SB as well had done a lot of work before the pandemic. And I would say that's another lesson learned, is that these agencies weren't starting from scratch. They had been thinking about their hiring processes, thinking about ways to improve them, so that then they were able to leverage this crisis to make some of that happen. The SBA, for example, had already redone all of their job descriptions. Over 800 of them were up to date and ready to go, so that when they needed to post these positions, they were able to do it. They also knew which hiring authorities they needed to leverage. Schedule A was what mostly what the SBA used. They knew how to use it effectively, and they had done so in the past. As far as recruiting and thinking about onboarding employees, Their senior team, once again, worked together as a collective unit, thinking about how to make that candidate experience strong and make sure the recruiting process was efficient. And they also applied a project management approach where they were tracking results and making sure that, once again, they worked together as a team. So I would really encourage you to read more about these agencies. It was very impressive that they were able to do that. And I hope it gives you all hope as you're thinking about what you need to accomplish in the upcoming months and year in terms of increasing your federal workforce, particularly in the area of technologists, when you're thinking about cyber, AI, et cetera. So with that, I think we're just going to open it up for any questions. Grace, I'm going to pass it over to you. Were there any questions that came in before we move to our amazing panel?
No, I didn't see any questions, but I did see a note that some people may be having trouble using the chat. I've adjusted the settings, so if you are continuing to have trouble, feel free to reach out to me.
And I think too, if you want to just put the questions in the chat, if for some reason the Q&A button is not working, we can always answer questions that way as well.
Absolutely.
Excellent. So we are so fortunate to have an amazing panel with us today. And what I love about this group is not only are they also distinguished in their own right, but they're bringing very diverse perspectives on this issue from across government agencies. So Jennifer Anastasoff, who is the Executive Director of the Tech Talent Project, and was also the former head of people at the U.S. Digital Service. We have Gwen DeFilippi, who's the Assistant Deputy Chief of Staff for Manpower, Personnel, and Services at the Air Force. We have Amanda Martens, who is a Senior Recruiter at the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. We have Amy Paris, who's a Digital Service Expert with the U.S. Digital Service and who's currently at HHS. And we have Brian Whittaker, who's the Director of Design and Development at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and was the former acting executive director of 18F at GSA. So welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. So my first question for all of you, and once again, you're each going to have a very different perspective on this. So thinking about the different strategies that we were talking about, what types of things have you all found most effective for surge hiring? And Jennifer, I'm going to start with you because you were helping to start a whole new agency.
Well, I would say thank you very much, Michelle. And I'm excited to be here amongst both the amazing panelists, but also with all of the hiring specialists who are out there. I know how hard it is for you. And so hopefully this will be able to provide some support, but just know that I know all of us really do want to support whenever possible. So your question in terms of like what was effective in surge hiring, and I would say number 1, 2, and 3, I'll add more, but 1, 2, and 3 is really first starting with this active recruiting. And active recruiting means, really truly going and identifying, and whether it's you as a hiring specialist, whether it's others who you're working with, but like identifying those folks who you think are going to be really amazing for the positions that are critical. There are a lot of folks out there, whether they be currently in a public sector position or in a private sector position, who want that opportunity to be able to give the most of themselves in a way that is going to be most effective. And if you are surge hiring, there is clearly a need right there and right then for someone someone that you find who fits all of your criteria. So I would say number 1 is actively recruiting. And I know most of the time, what folks have time to do, what folks have energy to do, and what we've all been taught to do is to post on USA Jobs and see what happens. Now, I'm not going to lie, for fun, and this gets you sense of my idea of fun, but like for fun, during spring break last year, I was, surfing through USA Jobs, identifying really interesting data and technical positions so that I could tell people about them. But that is not something that most folks do. And so if you know what the role is, or you're working with a hiring manager who knows what that is, that's a really critical piece. Number 2 is using hiring authorities, using the tools that are already available. There are tools that are already available. And if it's harder to use them than it should be, asking for help, right? And reaching out and saying, hey, this is harder to use than it should be. Hopefully this group will be helpful for that, but there are others as well. In addition, best practices and this is one of the tougher parts, but providing the best candidate experience during this time, making sure that candidates are still in constant communication, that folks know where they are, even if they're nowhere. It makes a huge difference because people are changing careers or they're changing fields because they deeply care about service. And so, we have one up on almost everything else because this is about service and it's about our country. The thing that is one of the biggest challenges is when folks don't hear or things don't move quickly. And then the next piece, I said use existing tools, subject matter expert based evaluation. So partnering with your hiring manager, as Paul was talking about, in order to be able to make sure that you're doing that subject-based hiring. I will say that if you're actively recruiting folks, if there are any technical fields, and I'm not just talking about technology and data, I'm talking about doctors, I'm talking about the rest, people really do appreciate talking with folks who understand their subject matter and who are experts in their subject matter. So all of those things, that's sort of general, but also very true when it comes to surge hiring. Last thing I will say, I helped start up a United States digital service. I was focused on the people aspect of it and trying to find folks. But I work very, very closely with our friends and colleagues in OMB and in other agencies at DHS and other places to be able to be supportive. And one of the most critical things was all agencies can use, you can use the authorities. So I just want to put that out there because one of the key things that I heard over and over again when I was in government, maybe it's still not the case that folks feel this way, but I heard so many times, oh, well, we were special at the time as USDS. We're not that special anymore. But you all can use that hiring authority. No one else can use it. And that it was simply not true. It was how we did it. And there are lots of folks who would love to be able to support you in thinking about how you can do it. I am one of those. So just so you know.
Thank you, Jennifer. So much in there. One of the things you talked about was the candidate experience, which makes me think about TTS and what you helped to stand up, Brian, there. And so I'd love to hear, what you all did at TTS, and then also any other general thoughts on strategies.
Sorry, that tricky mute button. But yes, in standing up the Centers of Excellence, I was very fortunate to be working with TTS's talent team, right? It's basically their recruitment arm. And as the hiring manager, standing up this new organization and addressing the needs of other agencies and the expertise that they needed, it was so great to partner with them. And they utilized a lot of the best practices that we had discussed today. One of the key things I was so impressed by and fortunate that they did was basically map out the experience of hiring, from identifying the need to actually getting someone in the seat and counting the days that the candidate was in each step of the process. And while we were collaborating with our talent team, we had to work with GSA's, human capital officers and formal HR organization to say, hey, here's what we're seeing. We're standing up this new organization in a cost recoverable model to meet an agency's need. Is there any way that we could be a little bit more efficient? Did you know that it takes this long to get through security or this long just to post the job? And in servicing that data and having that information, Human Resources at GSA was willing to work with us to either shuffle their talent to expedite people through these processes, or just to have a candid conversation with security about what can be done and responsiveness there. So I was grateful for that, and it definitely helped us move things forward. I think at one point we were anywhere from 140 days, and we were able to reduce it to about 90. So that was great, just being able to do that data analysis. In addition to that, not only did they have visibility into where each candidate was in the specific process, they kept in regular contact, right? And that was supremely helpful in preventing people from falling out of the hiring process and moving on elsewhere. And there were also just great advocates about the story, like, what is this opportunity to serve your country, to make some change and to do great work. So while I was just a hiring manager, and not necessarily a part of the talent or recruitment or HR process, just supremely grateful for all the hard work that they did.
Thank you. Amy, would love to ask you the same question, given your perspective at USDS and HHS. Any specific strategies that you have used in your capacity that you think have been very effective?
Sure. First of all, I want to give a shout out to Jennifer, who says I'm not special, or that USDS isn't currently special. That's a joke, of course. I'm glad actually that USDS isn't special. I'm glad that agencies do have access to Schedule AR hiring authorities, and hopefully, that's one method that they can use to bring in good talent. But I also have focused a lot of my time on revamping and sort of re-energizing the competitive hiring process through delegated examining, or DE hiring. And there are things that we can do there to modernize that process and bring great people in. One of them is getting away from the dreaded government style resume. Most people out there searching for jobs are not really looking forward to putting together a 10-page resume that has to have every single keyword cited. And the authority is already there. OPM has already blessed this work of moving to shorter, more industry standard style resumes that are 2 to 3 pages long. So that's one method. I think the other major method that I would talk about, active recruiting, huge, already mentioned, but also not relying on self-assessments. We're in an age where we're trying to hopefully recruit a more diverse hiring pool. We want to get as many people interested in civil service as possible. And we have a lot of evidence saying that self-assessments really disadvantage people who don't come in with a lot of confidence. So that's women, that's people of color, that's people who are immigrants, don't feel as comfortable rating themselves as excellent at everything. So moving away from self-assessments and into more standard resume review, written work sample assessments, and structured interviews is a great way to bring in more talent into the civil service.
Thank you so much. Gwen, so nice of you to join us today. We're grateful for your perspective from the Air Force. What strategies have you all used?
Thanks, Michelle. It's an honor to be on this panel, and I always learn something from everyone, so I'm taking notes as well. It's a little bit challenging to answer a question about surge hiring in an organization like the Air Force, where we have 670,000 employees at 92 installations around the world. Many of those are military employees, so we're only talking about 200,000 that are civilian employees. But when we think about it, a lot of what we're doing is more steady state, just trying to make the whole process move faster. And so, and in the last panel, Paul was talking about the dashboard and some of the changes we've made there. Happy to talk about those later. So I was thinking about the couple of examples where we did do surge hiring, and the two that come to mind are when we stood up the Space Force in December of 2019, there was an idea that we were going to have 18 months to get ourselves to initial operating capability, but the Congress had a different perspective, and that was that we should just go ahead and start a Space Force like the day they authorized it. And so at that point, we had a requirement to identify about 200 people to serve on the Chief of Space Operations staff to get the whole thing going. We had 60 of them on board. We needed 140 people as quickly as we possibly could. I think the main strategy that we employed to do that was to really think about prioritizing, like, how did we want to solve that problem? We were, did we want to bring on only the high graded people but no administrative staff? Who was going to schedule the meetings? Who was going to process the tasks? Who was going to do the work if we had all the leaders in place but nobody that does work, right? So, so thinking through like what was the right combination and what order do you want to hire, so that we could really focus the hiring managers on getting those job descriptions written, getting those interviews scheduled, et cetera. That was an important part of the puzzle for us in that. The other kind of big surge that we've been trying to do, and that's, I think, really more related to this discussion, is thinking about how we fill our software factories. And so we stood up a software factory in the Boston area and really needed to identify key talent for that job. And we knew we were competing in a very tough market with what, when we, are being not so kind to ourselves, with not good jobs, not good packages to put on the table, not competitive, right? Which is, of course, just totally not true. But anyways, so we decided that we would do a job fair. We have carved out a set of recruiters that actually use all of the normal job tools that people in the private sector would use, like Yellow and Handshake and all of those. And their job is to help us in these surge or in these hard to fill kind of jobs to actually go out and recruit talent rather than just posting jobs on USA Jobs and waiting to see who chooses to apply. So with their help, we had a recruiting fair. And so we invited like 500 people, and many of them actually even showed up. We had all of the things in place that we needed to, like for fingerprinting, for to get all of the stuff done so that by the end of the time that they were with us, if we liked them, we could do on-the-spot job offers. And in fact, we started a couple like within a couple of days of that job fair. So I think that idea of thinking a little bit differently, how do you bring together the resources you're going to need in the hiring process? So speed is important as it is in like the digital community. How do you put together all of those people so that you don't have candidates coming to you multiple times, but they come in one time and they're able to step through all of the different parts of your hiring process and get a result pretty quickly. So I think those are the two kind of big areas for us that have been about surge. And the rest of what we're doing is primarily just about how do we refresh our talent, how do we target and hire, but in more of a steady state kind of fashion. Over.
Thank you, Gwen. I'm going to switch the question up and start with you, Amanda, because Amanda, you are a senior recruiter at CISA, and we are focusing today on technologists. And so what unique considerations should everyone be thinking about when they want to recruit technologists to government?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think in general, you need to understand your hiring market and you need to understand your competition, but you also need to understand the driving factor for what motivates your audience to apply, right? And so once you have an understanding of all of those issues, you can begin to build your strategy. So what I find when I'm out recruiting, I often find that I'm speaking with a candidate who usually doesn't really know much at all about the federal hiring process, and we just find that that's what our market is. And for us to make a qualification determination. So, finding that sweet spot, we don't need a 10-page resume, but we definitely need certain things in general. And so educating our target audience on our CISA application process and what they
Amanda, I think we're starting to lose you a little bit. So let's come back. Let's come back to you. We'll see if we can reestablish your internet connection.
As they go through the pre-employment process is going to. Another thing to keep in mind is that the cyber. So we've taken a hard look at our internal hiring process, and we're working to understand any choke points in our recruitment and our time to hire. And so the other thing, we're working to really reduce those time to hire metrics as much as we can. And we also want to keep the lines of communication open. I know some people already talked about that, but you don't want your candidates to go into a black hole. The alternative to this is flipping the conversation, right? To have more of a relationship with your candidate. So instead of saying, hey, here's a job announcement, why don't you go ahead and apply? You say, hey, have you thought about your career in 6 or 10 months, or a year? Where do you want to be? Have you thought about the federal government? And so let's have a conversation on that timeline, and let's make the application process line up with their career timelines, right? And really, so that they understand and expect that, you're not going to apply today and get a job tomorrow unless you're the SBA, like what you said earlier today. But, just really helping people understand how they can fit in your organization and what to expect as they work through that application process.
Thank you, Amanda. Jennifer, this is really a passion for you, is thinking about getting technologists into government. What is your perspective on how should these agencies be approaching that particular market, and how can they sell them on the mission of government?
So a couple of things just to highlight, supporting all of the things that Amanda said. I know there were breaks in between, but they were also important. And I will fill in some of those blanks myself because I could hear them. I could hear her sharing them because they're so critical. But in terms of approaching the technical audience, look, folks, like you, like I, right? There are many folks who really want to support their country, who are excited about public service, but they don't know what it means. They've never experienced it. No one went to their college classes when they were taking computer science and spoke about the process. And if any of you, had that experience, please tell me, because you'd be the first that I would have heard about. But folks didn't go to their classes and say, think about government as a career, right? Largely, aside from NASA, I will say that, right? But and if they're surge hiring for astronauts, I'm sure we'd all apply. But that said, they haven't internalized what it takes or what it might mean to go into service. So I often say, starting with, from that active recruiting perspective, it's about starting with, it's starting with why. Why is this work important? How are you changing lives on a regular basis? And I will say this, and this is something for all of us, every one of you, especially hiring specialists, especially folks who are focused on bringing great people into government, you are so deeply critical, and the work that you're doing is so deeply critical to ensuring that every single one of the promises that our government makes to citizens and to people in the United States are carried out. And that we protect our general welfare, Gwen, right? Like we have in our general defense, right? So every single one of you is so critical to all of that. And you internalize it and you feel it on a day, you either feel it on a daily basis or remember it when you have a moment, right? But folks need to hear that from you, right? And it's so exciting and it's so interesting. And that's the part that's there. And I often hear, oh, we're not going to be able to get these people because it's, they make so much money in, name the field. And it's true. Like, folks do make more money in computer science or in technology, but they're not talking to the government about the money. They're talking to government about the service. And so starting with that is so key. And I think the key, in terms of approaching it, it's really utilizing those best practices. It's not focusing on post and pray. It is actively recruiting the right folks. It is, and I just want to highlight both what Amanda and Brian said is this, tracking, being able to track. And we used an Excel spreadsheet, right? And we just tracked how many people has it taken longer than 30 days to hear from anyone or to move through any part of the process. And no one else was tracking that at the time. No one else had time to do it. So we did, and we made the time to do it. And we're able to share back, hey, everyone. And Brian brought up HR. And I think, it's also, it's others in the process too, to say, hi, everyone, it's taking this long. We'd like it to move a little faster. And being able to do that is so critical. And really it's the speed and it's the consistent communication. Speed above consistent communication, because if you have to communicate with people every week, which we did for months, it starts, you like them and all, but it doesn't feel surgy anymore at that point. So I think that those are some really, really critical pieces. And I would just say, trust that folks do want to do well for their country. And if they don't, candidly, move on. Go to the next one.
Gwen, you talked about Boston and setting up a software factory in Boston. And we know 85% of federal employees are outside of the Washington, D.C. metro area. So is there a particular challenge when you're thinking about regional areas? Do you have to sell that government message, that employee value proposition even harder? And what did you do apart from like the hiring first? Did you think about different things as you think about recruiting outside of the DMV?
That's an interesting question. We really have all of our hiring centralized in San Antonio. So like the people that process and do most of the work are sitting there. So we're really relying on the local installation to make themselves available to the community around surrounding them, and to sell civil service, to sell military service, to help educate the surrounding community about what's valuable. And so we do that through things like air shows and invitations to educators to come on bases to see, what it's all about. But certainly we fall into this problem that people think that if you join the military, you can only do it by wearing a uniform. I had a colleague when I worked in the Army who went out to Google, and he said he was walking around and he told someone that you could join, the Army as a civilian employee. And they're like, this is just a ruse. You're just gonna like force me into service and never let me go. I'm not doing it. It's like, I don't understand how to communicate better. So we do have that barrier to overcome. We've been working on trying to integrate our military and civilian recruiting efforts, because of course we have recruiters in, like, basically almost every city and state around the country, to try to help people understand the value of service. And they've often thought of themselves as really just focused on the enlisted recruiting mission, which is massive. I mean, we'll recruit 30,000 new airmen a year. The Army does 80,000. The Marine Corps and Army are in the space as well. But we charge them to start thinking about, like, the whole workforce, because sometimes they're talking to someone that's not qualified, right? And how much better would it be to say, like, hey, and there's another opportunity if you want to be a civilian employee, and here's how you get there. But anyways, so we do rely to some extent on the installation. Where we're really focused from a regional perspective is trying to make sure that when we hire kids out of college, and we have a unique authority in DoD where we can go to college campuses and directly recruit, that we're reaching out to all colleges and universities to really try to get a cross section of what we would like to refer to as low professional experience kind of individuals into civil service. So we're at this point sitting at something like 55% veterans. So it's really important to us to get to that pool of talent that hasn't had a chance to really be in the workplace yet, to give us different perspective, different ideas. And we do that through the Premier College Intern Program, where we're picking kids up between junior and senior year of college, bringing them in for an in-person experience for a week or so, and then sending them out to an installation where they get a hands-on experience. We're recruiting in the fall of each year for the summer following it, so that we can work through our security clearance issues, so that when they get on board, they have a real experience, not getting cocky and like shredding, but like actually doing work that has meaning. And then we also are checking in throughout the course of their internship, because we know sometimes we put people with supervisors that really just aren't, they're not going to inspire the next generation of talent. They're going to kind of beat it down and try to help them understand the pecking order. And that's not what we want in this experience. So we're checking in with these interns pretty regularly to make sure that if they're having a bad experience, that we can engage and move them to a different supervisor that'll engage the talent. So that's kind of a big part of our strategy, is to try to get our message out in a more broad way. And I'm not sure if I answered any of the question that you wanted, but hopefully that was helpful.
Very helpful. Amy, you posted something in the chat talking about going back to this idea that often is referred to as the employee value proposition, right? So what is kind of your outward messaging? How would you entice people to want to come work for your agency? And so I want to give you an opportunity to talk about your blog posts.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is part of how we recruit, but it's also part of how we allow people who are doing this work to talk about, how important it is that they're serving the public good. And I think often people who are in public service don't really get a broad platform for which to speak about this. We can talk about it to each other, right? We talk about, like, wow, it's so amazing. We helped 1,000 people today. We helped 1 million people today, and it feels wonderful. But how do we communicate that to people who don't live and breathe that experience? So these blog posts serve as a way of saying, here's why I left a potentially higher paying job in industry. Here's the value that I got coming here into government and the things I get to work on that really empower me. And I think that this also starts to build a model that young people and people in college can start to see themselves in the people who are currently in federal service. And I think that takes a lot of the place of, especially during the pandemic, we can't go into schools necessarily and give speeches. We can't all be astronauts, unfortunately. And so there, if we're not going to be on TV, if as public servants, it's going to be harder to see our work day to day in a broader model. One way of getting that out there is to start to publish blog posts, tweets, and other media. The other thing I'll add to that is just the mentorship model. I know a lot of people at USDS have taken it upon themselves in their spare time, not as civil servants, but in their personal capacity, to serve as mentors for young people coming up through undergraduate and graduate programs. And that's another great model for civil servants to be able to spread the message, to educate young people on what it is to do this work and how valuable it can be.
Thank you. Brian, I want to ask you a question, just kind of to change the topic a little bit, but the partnership is always thinking about recruiting young talent. So all of this speaks to me very personally. But one thing we often talk about is the importance of retaining the talent too. So you may not retain them forever, but you certainly don't want to lose them after 30 days, after you've worked so hard to bring them on. So given your experience at 18F and TTS, and even at CFPB, like, what are you all doing, or what have you seen to be effective in keeping this talent that you've worked so hard to recruit?
Sure, that's a great question. And I think full transparency, I think there's a lot of opportunity on that front, especially as it pertains to term hires, right? So getting those folks in for 2 years, at what point do you really start engaging them to say, hey, this timeline's coming up. How can we really partner with you with the network that we have to ensure that these people that have come in from industry, gotten to learn the culture and how government works, stays in government and continues to bring that energy and helps support some of the most difficult challenges that we're facing today. But I'd say TTS did a great job of community building and employee engagement, whether that was through a series of Ask Me Anythings, or AMAs for short, where you can come and have transparent conversations and ask the questions about the direction of the organization. In virtual spaces, a practice at 18F, exhibited was setting up virtual sort of like lunch meetings. You'd have a Zoom call like at one block in the Eastern time zone, then Central and Pacific. So people that are all across the nation working in the organization still have some time to get together and get to know each other. And then the other piece too is, and of course this is rather unique in that, 18F, USDS, and the Centers of Excellence were more so a consultative organization, focusing on how you can keep their skills fresh, let them know about what is the latest approach or technology, and doing that at a regular cadence. So at the Centers of Excellence, while we had, let's say, 5 or 6 different customer agencies that we were working with, every 2 weeks we would have a Friday that was designated for Home Base Day, where everyone would come back, huddle, receive a presentation, whether it was from GitHub or Microsoft, or teams even breaking out into their subgroups to talk about their best practices and what they've learned. So I think employee engagement is really key, and figuring out how to address where do you go after your term ends, and or revisiting from a technical section of workforce, thinking through that career ladder and pipeline. So those are some of the things we did to keep the retention.
Just a quick pitch: June 29th, best places to work in the federal government rankings will be coming out. So for those of you that score very well, job applicants do look at those rankings. Amanda, would love to come back to you. The job market is so hot for cybersecurity. I mean, it's very, very difficult for anybody to recruit and retain people in that field. What types of strategy is CISA using to try to keep that talent for as long as they can?
Yeah, I think, one of the really great programs that we use and we hire a lot from is the Scholarship for Service program. This program is so near and dear to my heart. So for those that don't know about SFS, it's a program that gives scholarship money to cyber degree seeking students, and these scholarships are competitively awarded. So these are, very students that are, they're hustlers, right? And so in exchange for that scholarship, the student agrees to work an internship and then a postgraduate service commitment. And so right there, if you hire them for that postgrad service commitment, you're going to get them for, at least 2 years, if not 3, guaranteed. But the catch is that when you hire the interns, they don't necessarily have to do their postgrad service in the same agency. And so one of the things that we're doing, we're hiring our largest class to date this summer. We're bringing on more than 50 summer interns. And so around the July timeframe, we'll reach out to the hiring officials and we'll say, hey, here are some options for you if you want to keep your intern. And so some of them will go on leave without pay for the semester. Some of them will continue to work, 10 or 20 hours part-time. But the idea is to keep them on the rolls and keep them engaged and continue to let them work until they graduate. And then we can offer them that permanent position. So just kind of like keep your hooks in them, if you will. But, some of the other really great things that we had going on for us is our interns do developmental and rotational opportunities and while they're with us, and they get to see other parts of CISA and other parts of even the department. And so that's a really big draw to get them to come in and want to intern with us in the first place. We were one of the very few agencies last summer that were able to continue our internships into the virtual environment. And so both of those things I think were really big draws. So having a draw to get them in and then finding ways to keep them in and communicating with the student and with the hiring officials, this is the career path, this is the trajectory of how you can keep them and so they can see a future with your agency.
So critical and such an underutilized tool across government. Thank you for that. We are almost at time. So what I would love to do is just do one more round robin. We've covered a lot of ground in a very short amount of time. Do you have one kind of final piece of advice to all the hiring managers and HR specialists who are listening in, before we leave the session today? And I'm going to start with Amy.
I might be taking the most unpopular stance of anyone here. I'm going to say, don't give up on competitive hiring. The mission of civil service is so important, and we want to bring in as wide of a net of people as we possibly can. We want to not just serve all of the people in this country, but ideally we want the people who perform that service to represent all of the people in this country. And the best way we can do that is by engaging in competitive hiring. When you go to direct hire, look, it is a tool in your tool belt and everyone should use it if they need to, but it can lead to hiring people that often look like us and sound like us, people who we might know as contractors. I think going to delegated examining and using the flexibilities within delegated examining to use shorter resumes, to use subject matter qualification assessments, leveraging SMEs, and going through a process that has, a relatively unbiased interview process are all keys to success. Thanks.
Thank you. And not unpopular at all. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, that horrible phrase, but we certainly want to be focused on reforming that process as well and making it the best that it can be. Gwen, last words.
Yeah, I think you have to use all the tools, and I think that we have to get past the part where we think of ourselves as not the premier place to work. In the end, we are what gives this country an ability to exist. And so we have a lot to sell. We have an amazing mission, an opportunity to do work that you wouldn't be able to do legally anywhere else. And that's very attractive to a lot of people. And if we are able to think that way, then we can start to expand and reach different parts of our country and get to a broader and more diverse workforce. I know it's true in the Air Force that we are not very diverse at our more senior ranks than we need to be. I think it's probably true based on looking at OPM data and other federal agencies as well. And if we're really going to get there, to Amy's point, we have to stop looking in the places that we would traditionally look. We have to look even broader to bring in more perspectives and to realize the value of civil service, which is that you too can step forward and help your nation be an amazing part of the world and a great place to live. So I think we've got a lot to offer, and I'm certainly happy to follow up with anyone that has specific questions. And it's really been an honor to be part of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Amanda.
The best piece of advice I ever got from a mentor was get to yes. Right? Legally, I've added on legally, get to yes legally, but try and get to yes, right? So, offer solutions, think outside of the box, right? Are you looking at the candidate and your issue holistically? Are there other ways to bring on the candidate? Is there a different position that you could put that candidate in, right? Just because somebody didn't qualify for this position, what other vacancies do you have in your organization? So don't just answer one question, come to know, and then stop. Right? Try and come to a solution. In HR, we're famous for saying no a lot of times. And, we're inevitably going to have to say no in some situations. But if you can get to the point where you are a solution finder, where you are providing alternative strategies, you're going to build the trust of your hiring officials. And when you do have to say no, they're going to respect you for it.
Love that. Brian, It's hard to follow that. It's yes.
I'd say I've heard a lot of the conversation today about speed and, having had the pressure of standing up a new organization. I totally respect the speed. I think one thing that I would add is, take some time to focus on diversity. I know when the pressure is hot, you've got to get someone in seat quickly and ideally the most talented person, but keeping a lens on the diversity of your talent and your recruiting efforts, I think will be beneficial in the long run. So keep that diversity in mind.
100%. Thank you for that. Jennifer, last word.
Exceedingly fast, diverse teams. No, not exceedingly fast, because we have to do we have to follow all of Amanda's points. No, the key pieces I would say are, I often say, and many do, but like people are policy, right? So if that's true, what it means is that everyone who's listening to this call and folks on this call are some of the most important folks in the work that's happening. And in any surge hiring, if someone comes to you for a surge, it's because whatever it is critically important. And so you are those critical partners. I would add my own nuance to Amy's point, which is we have to use the tools that exist. We should not create more hiring authorities, but the hiring authorities that are there are tools that you can use, that are legal to use, that are okay to use. And in parallel, ensuring that we are utilizing and exploring the ways that exist. I just dropped something in there about the subject matter expertise qualifications assessment, SMEQA for short. But that utilizing the competitive service and in order to be able to do that surge hiring is also possible. So explore all of those options from a getting to yes perspective. And again, I would just say that there are people who want to support you in this effort, who want to be a resource in this effort. Michelle is clearly deeply excited and engaged in this as well. The partnership is the organizations that we're all a part of. So I'm just going to keep saying that because a lot of times it can feel so much like, oh yeah, they want me to do all of this. And it's true, they do, but there are others who really want to also help you get to that yes in a way that's going to make sense.
I love it. We are a united front, all caring very deeply about these issues. I did want to make sure that we opened it up for any questions. Grace, I did want to check with you. Were there any questions for the panelists?
Yeah, there was one question actually. The question is, are any agencies using the IPEDS data on Data USA to make recruiting more equitable?
That would be a great thing to figure out.
Yeah, I don't know in the Air Force. It's a good question.
All right, we will follow up on that. I think we're all intrigued about what this could mean, could possibly open up new doors. Excellent. Thank you all so much. This has been very enlightening and so helpful to everybody who's watching today. And it is being recorded and will be posted so that people can continue to use this as a reference. And I'm going to hand it over to Grace to end the session today.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone for attending today. This is such a special, near and dear topic to all of us. So continue to have this conversation. I'm not going to say you can LinkedIn, friend everyone here, but you might want to give it a shot. And yes, as Michelle said, we will be sending out a recording of this session to everyone who has registered. So if you have friends that weren't able to make it but do want to view, they can still register and get the recording. So thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful day.